Good evening and welcome everyone to the third episode of Webster Speaks, Dialogues on Race, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm your moderator, Earl McCoy Jr. Just want to let everybody know we meet every other Wednesday to discuss issues connected to racism, social justice, and the meaning of equity. Tonight's theme is the effect of systematic racism on the mental health of African Americans. Feel free to ask questions tonight on Twitter using the hashtag Webster Speaks. We will get to as many questions as we can during our live conversation. Now, I'll turn it over to our host, Webster's Chief Diversity Officer, Vincent C. Fewellen.
Thanks, Earl. And good evening and welcome to Webster Speaks. I'm honored to have Dr. Jameca Woody Cooper, who is a colleague at the university, but also specializes in providing psychotherapy and counseling to people of color, women, and seniors in her practice here in St. Louis. Her practice is Emergent Psychological Services, and she's also a program director for Applied Educational Psychology Program, School Psychology Program. And as I said, is an adjunct professor at the university in Applied Educational Psychology. Dr. Cooper's appearance is well appreciated and very timely for us as we will discuss the issues of systemic racism and the mental health in our Black community. So welcome, Dr. Cooper, Woody Cooper, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you. This is an interesting conversation, I think, for us as people of color. I think so often we tend to not really get involved in these conversations. I think so often we also have this belief and this balance of our faith, right, in guiding us, and also the need for our mental health, right? And so often I think for us as Black people, we have this conversation around, praying it away, right? And so I'm looking very much forward to hearing from you what you think about many of these topics. Before we go kind of to set the context, according to the Minority Health Office of the Department of Health and Human Services, Black adults are about 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than their white peers. They are also more likely to have feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and worthlessness. 16% of Black Americans reported having experienced mental illness in their previous year. So I'm curious to know from you, to kind of start with our conversation, what are some of those fears that hang over Black society, right? We're thinking in terms of fear of police brutality, microaggressions, discrimination, driving or walking while Black, barbecuing while Black, bird watching while Black. These are constant stressors for us, in addition to the work environment. We've often find ourselves always walking on these eggshells. What does it cause? Anxiety, depression, paranoia?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And if you think about many of the issues that African Americans deal with in this country, it all revolves around systems or institutions in this country that are really prejudicial, unequal. So if we look at housing, like in St. Louis specifically, where is the best housing? It's in certain parts of town, and it's usually afforded to only people who look a certain way and have a certain amount of money. So it is class and race. But if we look at wealth, there's a huge wealth gap in this country. If you look at some of the numbers, in 2016, average wealth for African American families was $17,000 versus white families, it's $170,000. So that's 10 times the difference. If you look at infant mortality and the fact that Black babies are twice as likely to die in this country. And then if you just turn to police brutality for 1 second, you will see that there's a huge difference in how different races are treated in this country. So if you put all those things together, you have to think, like, why wouldn't a person that's African American in this country feel anxious? Why wouldn't they feel depressed? And why wouldn't they feel traumatized based on these systems that they've been forced to endure in their lifetime? It's so many factors that we won't even have time to talk about today. But one of the things that stuck out for me as we were getting ready to prepare for the show is that either yesterday or today, they released the body cam footage from George Floyd's arrest. And I don't know if you saw it, but I saw it briefly. And I must say, it was probably the most heartbreaking thing that I've seen in years. The fact that I'm looking at this African-American male, tall, adult male that by any means we would say is, strong, confident. And he was pleading for his life. And he told the officers that he was claustrophobic, that he had been shot before. So if we look at that incident, just that one in and of itself, and erase all the other ones, why wouldn't African Americans in this country feel depressed? If you feel like your life doesn't matter, if you feel like you're going to tell an officer that you're anxious and you're scared and that they'll do nothing to help you, why wouldn't you feel depressed about that? That's traumatizing. It was traumatizing for me to watch it. So we have to imagine that African Americans as a community are traumatized as a community and individually as well.
And I think often re-traumatized, not only do we experience our own trauma, right? But in watching the video that you referenced, or, this morning I saw the Aurora, Colorado Police Department pulled over a vehicle, a mother and 3 or 4 young children, and they were all handcuffed face down to the ground, right? And so even in seeing that this morning in my like that's the start of my day, right, as a Black person. And so it's that trauma, it's that constant reminder for us. And so it's not only our stuff, but it's also then having to, see over and over the clips of George Floyd or the Aurora situation once again in that city. It's hard stuff.
And it's stuff that we have to live with every day. So I get the question sometimes when I'm teaching classes from white students about, well, why are African Americans so distrustful? Why are they anxious? And I'm thinking there are lots of issues, but if we just look at some of them that are day-to-day issues, for me as an African American female, even though I'm a professional in this community, when I see sirens and I see a cop following me, I'm instantly afraid. And I'm not just afraid like, ooh, I'm going to get a ticket for speeding. I'm afraid and wondering if I'm going to make it home that day. So that's a different level of fear. And when you wake up every day with that level of fear, wondering if you're going to make it home, what's going to happen to you or your children, most people can't sleep at night. It's the type of thing that it gets implanted in your DNA. It gets implanted in your respiratory system in the way you breathe. It gets implanted in the way that you see each and every situation. So it's no wonder why so many people are depressed and anxious.
And so in that depression and that anxiety that we experience, why is there such a stigma for us in our community in terms of seeking help?
Well, go back to one of the things you said early on is, in the Black community, most of us were raised in the church. And most of the time it's a Baptist church. So in that realm, we're all kind of raised to believe that church and Jesus and everything about church and Jesus will save you if you just pay attention to it and believe in it, right? So we've all grown up that way, and we've been told that that is our help. So now that we're all beginning to suffer with mental illnesses, it's a conflict for many people. They're wondering if they say outwardly that they are suffering with depression, then will they be seen as being not committed to their religion or weak or not able to handle their own affairs? It's a lot of that that's really revolved around. And most of it is based in religion, but also some of it is based in just this stereotype that African Americans have to be stronger than the average person. So in other words, they should not feel depressed because you should be strong, snap out of it. So that's part of the stigma as well.
We come from good stock, we right? And that into itself is pressure, right? Like this added pressure. We have to be better than, we have to show up differently, right? And so we continuously add some of the stressors to ourselves as well. And so how do we distinguish between the societal problems and mental health problems?
I think when we look at societal problems, we're really focusing on things like, if we look at St. Louis, things like crime, things like unequal education, those type of things. Those are societal problems. Those are societal problems that can cause mental health problems, but usually those things are totally different. One is like the cause and one is the effect. mental health problems. They're society's problems in that we really are going to have to pay more attention to them. I think 20 years ago, it was just this thing that happened that we know people experience, but not a lot of people experience. It wasn't a big of a deal, but now more people are starting to have conversations publicly about mental illness and the fact that they suffer from certain things. So it's becoming more of a societal issue, and that society is going to have to put more money into it, and we're going to have to pay more attention to it because it's hurting a lot of people, mostly our youth at this point.
So when we think about, some of those societal issues, again, here we are in St. Louis. And our last show, we had the privilege of having Mayor Ella Jones, who is the mayor of Ferguson. And when you think about the incidents of Ferguson 2014, we recently had, this reinvestigation into that case, resulting in yet again no charges being filed against that officer. We have these fresh wounds yet open. What are some of the psychological effects around that, you think?
That's a really good question. And I've seen it go both ways. Like if you look at this as far as just last night with the win of Cori Bush, right? This is something that is a direct result of the riots and the looting and the protest in Ferguson. She says that, and she openly says that this all started because she was one of the people that was out getting tear gassed and tortured by law enforcement. So this caused her to really move in a different way and be more of an activist. So I think on some ends, we do see that piece. We see people who've been more resilient and been able to be productive and take this and use this as something to propel them into better things. She would be one example of that. But I think on the other end of that, you see people who feel more devastation, more frustration. And for those who are really consistent activists, they're exhausted and they're burnt out because they've been doing this for years now, and they're not seeing the type of impact and the change that they had hoped to see in the past 6 years since Ferguson.
Can you talk a little bit about that exhaustion and that burnout?
So for those people that have been out prior to Ferguson and involved a lot in the Ferguson things, and of course the Stockley and everything we've had recently, those are the ones that people call when it's time to protest. They're on the front lines. They're at all the protests. They're taking their family sometimes. Bruce Franks is one example of that. And if you watch this documentary, you can see the burnout. He talks about the depression and the burnout that's involved with being involved in something, but at the same time suffering yourself and being a victim of that same system. So it's the exhaustion of working and working and working and working and not seeing the change that you want to see. And then at the same time being impacted by those same systems outside of that protest.
So it's interesting, we talk about racism, we talk about police officers, and, that's certainly a large part of that. And I'm curious, from your perspective, the psychology of these racist officers. Is this something that's institutionalized, in the sense of the blue culture? Or is it, this idea of a few bad apples, get publicity for their actions? And what do the bad apples in the group have in common?
This is one of those things I talk about a lot with different people. I was just having this conversation earlier today, this whole idea of the defund the police. For me, I feel like the whole system of law enforcement is corrupt in this country. And it has been used in some ways that are shameful for lots of communities of color across the country. So do I think it's a few bad apples? I think it's more than a few bad apples. It's a lot of bad apples. And the good apples are not doing anything to stop the bad apples. Now, can they, based on the corrupt system, would it be dangerous for them to speak up or do so? Probably. Would bad things happen to them? Probably. Is there a way out for the good apples? I'm not sure that there is, given that I'm not in that system. But what I do know is that it would be very difficult to revamp that system, given that there are so many bad apples. And I'm not sure what has to be done about it. I think it has to be a lot of education and training and a lot of funding and resources that need to be removed, reduced, and restructured. Because if we can shift a lot of it to mental health and public safety, I think we can solve the problems just in a different way.
So, the stressors for us as we are starting to identify are huge, right? And there's the racism at work, there's the societal pieces. We happen to also be living now through a global pandemic, and it is touching Black and brown lives in ways that are just obviously inequitable and are hard for us. Can we talk a little bit about COVID and its impact on our community as well?
Well, what we've seen in St. Louis is that the numbers of COVID are different based on the color of your skin. So more Black and brown people have been infected and are dying from COVID. So we know that with the numbers. So what I found in my career, and other psychologists have also said, is that what we see is this just like increase. I want to say almost like 3 or 4-fold increase in African Americans who are seeking counseling now. So what COVID-19 has done is that it's really been the straw that's breaking the camel's back in a lot of ways. So people have been living with a lot of trauma, anxiety, and depression for years and sometimes decades. But this has seemed to tip the scales a bit. And now people are realizing, oh my God, I really can't function. I need to deal with these issues that have been apparent in my life for many, many years. And the other thing that has happened from COVID is that it's taught us that all health is not equal. Like all medical care is not equal. Everyone doesn't have access to the same types of care and resources that can help to save your life. So that's a difference as well.
And then we have the sense of, I would imagine, isolation too, right? And we hear that story regardless of color. But as we are focusing in on some of our conversation about our community and Black folks here, wondering, has that obviously exacerbated the mental health of African Americans?
I'm not sure that the COVID in and of itself has exacerbated, but the restrictions and the isolation has probably exacerbated the mental health care. But I would say I definitely see that more in my older adult patients who are in residential care facilities. I would say they have experienced it the most as far as isolation. So most people who live and work independently are able to have enough freedom so that they're okay. But I think what COVID, and I don't think it was just COVID, I think it was the combination of the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and the COVID. I think those together seem to impact people in a way that made them more aware and more, they're paying attention more to injustice.
What's the state of mental health services here locally in our Black community?
Well, twofold. So we do have institutions in St. Louis that offer mental health care, and some of them have been around for a while. Hopewell is one of those that's been here for years. Now we have Affinia. We have other agencies that provide mental health care. So we have the agency, community mental health centers that provide health care. We have universities. We also have churches. But I think when people look at what independent practitioners are like, we probably don't have the numbers of those in St. Louis that we need. Although we have a good number of African-American counselors, social workers, and psychologists, it's probably not enough given the numbers of African-Americans that we have in the area. So that could definitely stand to be increased. And I'm not sure if or when that will happen, just based on the numbers that are being produced every year.
How important do you think it is for people of color to seek support from therapists who are of color as well?
Well, I've always thought that it was important for people to seek out people who look like them if you feel that that is a person who can best understand you. And now everyone doesn't feel like that. Like some people have grown up in different environments and that's not necessary for them. But what I've seen in the past 2 months is that there's been a huge increase in African Americans who are seeking therapy, and many of them explicitly state that they only want to see an African American provider, and that is very important to them because they want to be understood. So it can be important for the mental health of the person, but what studies have shown is that when African Americans finally get to the point where they seek therapy, they tend to be recipients of poor treatment when the therapist does not look like them, and they also tend to end treatment too soon. So that just means that they're not getting what they need. They're getting out too quickly before their needs get met. So if we can put all those things together, I can definitely see why people would want an African American therapist. Any situation where you're going to feel better and more understood, I think is helpful in a therapeutic setting, because it's already hard enough for people to finally get the courage to even take that first step to get there.
What I have learned, I mean, this is a little bit of self-disclosure. Several years ago, I lost my mother, and it took about a year or so before I actually thought the need for therapy, right? I have my master's in social work, so I understand the importance of it, but it took some time, to your point, for me to get there. And I went thinking I was going to go to deal with my mom and her death, right? And the absence. And that was a part of it. But what it turned out to be was just so much more digging and peeling back these, they talk about this onion, right? And these layers, and it really became about me, right? And it's to the point now where I need my therapist. And I wish that we would get to a space where we really could understand the importance of this for our community and for our individuals. I'm going to ask Earl to share any questions that we may have received. We have asked our audience to send questions via Twitter to hashtag Webster Speaks. And so, Earl, do you have any questions at this point? And those of you who are listening, if you have any questions, again, Twitter, hashtag Webster Speaks.
We have a great question, and the question reads, why is it important for Blacks to seek mental health from their peers and not those of the dominant culture? The Black family system has been turned upside down and decimated. What are the first steps in addressing this issue?
So the question is, why should African Americans seek help from African Americans? Correct?
Yes, that is the first part. Yes.
Okay. I think it's necessary because we're living in a time in our country where African Americans are very, very aware that they're not understood by the dominant culture, which is white culture in this country. And so as a result of that, they want to go to a place where they can seek refuge from the stressors in the day-to-day world. They want to go to someone and talk that has a similar background and can understand their issues, because I think it's totally different when you're sitting across from someone from a different race or culture that has not, or you assume has not had those same experiences that you have had growing up. So maybe your parents said certain phrases, your grandparents did certain things, but if you go to another African American therapist, you know that they're going to share, or you assume that they're going to share some of those same experiences. It breaks the ice a lot, and it makes the therapeutic relationship and the comfort level and the trust that's necessary for really, really effective therapy, it makes that a lot easier. So I can understand why they would want to. And I think the flip side of that is, why do they not want to see therapists that are white as much as they have in the past? And that is because the distrust level is higher recently, based on some of the things that we see in our current political administration, based on some of the things that now, just with cameras, we're able to see a lot of things that are going on all across the country that make the communication between white and Black people different. And so people are seeking places where they can feel heard and acknowledged and not judged and pathologized. So I think that's mostly what people are looking for.
Good one. Thank you. Do you have another question, Earl?
Yeah, part two to that question was, the Black family system has been turned upside down and decimated. What are the first steps into addressing this issue and probably solving this issue as well?
That's a hard question, because that's really generational. And it how has the Black family been turned upside down? Geez, we can go back historically all the way through Jim Crow, sharecropping,
Right.
Black men going off into war, all the way into now with the incarceration systems. You can look at all of that. And so it has, I agree with the question that the Black family has been dismantled. And I think for a lot of the issues that are current in the Black society, the Black family would help that if it was stronger, if it was more cohesive. But what does that take? It takes the dismantling of some of the institutional and structural systems that have made some of these issues possible.
And that's the work right there. That's the work right there. And I think that is where we are really, as I've said before, at this reckoning in America, and really a choice that we have to make in terms of looking at the institutions that have led us to this place, right? We can certainly, you and I both are professionals. Many of us on this, WebEx are professionals, and we've been blessed and we've worked hard, and but we just represent a portion of our population, right? And often are then used to lift up and say, well, if you've done it, then why can't others do it, right? We have the Oprahs, we have those, who've made it at that particular level. But the systems are the ways in which they are. Education, you talked about housing in North St. Louis, right? Like all of that has an impact that is generational. We talk about access to resources. We have not had generational wealth because systems were put in place that prevented us from achieving those. And so it's not a matter of, I don't think, of Black folks now just kind of waking up and going at it, right? We go at it. We persevere. We work hard.
We've gone at it.
And continue to, right? And despite all of that. And so we just need for some systems to change. I guess as we're kind of talking about, some of these institutional pieces and the roles of white folks here, talk about the mental health and racism as it applies to white people. On the one end of the spectrum, we have the blatant racists, right? As displayed predominantly, by some of our police officers, white people who confront African Americans just for going about their daily lives. What's going on there?
Many people want this whole idea of you can't be called racist, and that just setting people off because they don't want to be lumped in that category. Unfortunately, many people fall into that category. And what it is that I think we see people as all being the same type of racist. That's the only face of, and that's not true. If I had to do a pie chart, I would say probably 20% of the racists are those like die hard, I want to go out and kill people type of racists, or less. And these may not be people in urban areas. And then you have the ones that are allies that are really, on the progressive side, and they're out working and communicating and trying to make things better. And then the rest of the people, so we're looking at about 55-60% of the rest of the racists fall into one category, which is they're the people that are silent. They're the people that are numb. Those are the people that when they hear a racist joke or witness something, they say nothing. These are the people that are engaging in the daily microaggressions. These are the people that are calling, the one who called the bird watcher? That call is the people that are calling on Black people for doing basically nothing, for just existing. Those are the people that fit into that category. And most of those people would consider themselves to be liberal. But they're so liberal, they're often arrogant. So they're not open to hearing the views of other people or to change and to realizing that they're wrong in a lot of ways. So that's the other piece of racism, that we have to look at the people who are really imposing these racist views and acts on other people.
So would you say there's a psychological cost of racism to white people?
Yes, I would definitely say there is. I'm not sure the white people would agree, but I'm a psychologist, so that's what I would say. I would say the cost is that to white people who are racist is that the fear, like they're not all the same. So you have those that are engaged in such high levels of fear of the unknown. I'm so afraid. I don't even want to be bothered with this that I don't know anything about. And I think then there's another part of races that, because they understand at some level what's going on and they want to maintain the power structure and the patriarchy in this country. So you have two types. And I think the cost of it to whites is that, one, they maintain the power. That's part of the cost. It's a real financial cost that goes with that. If you maintain power, what does that mean? You get the best houses, you get the best rates on loans, you make the most money. There is a real cost with that. And then the other part of that is the fear of the unknown is maintained from racist whites from generation to generation. It's something that they begin to pass down to their children and their grandchildren. But I think one of the best things that I think is the cost of racism is that white individuals who are racist miss out on the richness that is this country. Part of the reason of the democracy of this country was built on was diversity and freedom and individuality. But when you're so caught up in not wanting to engage and fearing something that you have no idea what it really is, I think you miss out on the richness of what the fabric of this country is and should be.
So there's something about white guilt in there as well. People wanting to understand their own racism and, to be led to a deeper understanding, but may not actually know how to go about it in the most helpful of ways, or on some level just being paralyzed as a result of that, and wondering if you could talk some about that.
So the white guilt is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this. This is Robin DiAngelo book, White Fragility. That's one of it's flying off the shelves in the past few months. There it is. Look, there you have it. So it's a bestseller. And it's a bestseller because the author of this book is saying some of the things that Black people have been saying for generations. But she's white, so it's easily received. So some of the things she talks about is this white guilt, right? And so part of the whole foundation of white privilege is the fact that you can be guilty about something and therefore shut down the conversation because you explicitly state your guilt, or you try to avoid your guilt, because we've all heard the statements where my family's never owned slaves, right? I've never engaged in racism. I'm not racist. I have a Black friend. So those things should tell you that I'm not racist. And so that's part of that guilt. They're trying to avoid and get away from the guilt by telling you those things. So it's a really big part of the white privilege that is quite evident in this country. And so part of the white privilege is the luxury of not having to talk about your whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime you confront a white individual with what does your whiteness mean to you, or what have you done against racists, or blah, 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 that's where they go. It's this guilt part. In a lot of ways, it ends the conversation, right? Because if you're guilty, you can't really engage in effective and healthy conversation. And if you're guilty about it, it kind of stops you from learning and from growing into getting what you need out of it. So that is a part of it. And psychologically, some white people are going to be stuck there. They're going to just sit in that guilt and not engage in anything because that's where they're comfortable.
How would you say ways in which whites could actually be allies in this work?
Well, one of the things I say, and I try to go about it in a real way, because I understand, and I learned this in Ferguson, like during the protests. I was out in a few of those at the time, and I remember teaching a class, and I remember the look on my white students' face when they thought I was trying to tell them that they should go to the protest. And I was like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I don't think everyone needs to go to the protest. Right. I don't think everyone needs to have social media posts about that. I think there are different levels and different ways that people can be engaged. But one of the first things I would say for white people is to stop saying that I'm not racist. Because on some level, maybe you are. Maybe a lot of us are. So I think that's one of the things they have to remove from their vocabulary, one. And then the other thing is, I think they can surround themselves by people that don't look like them. If they can do that, that's where they're going to really learn the most. And sometimes you have to engage in some research and some, like the book you just held up, maybe they need to read that book first. That will be a good place to start. Maybe they can join some Facebook groups and engage with people that are like-minded. Maybe they can engage in real life groups that are in St. Louis that talk about race, culture, and oppression, like the We Stories group in St. Louis, those type of things. And then maybe that will give them the courage and the comfort to then surround themselves with people that don't look like them. So both in a social setting, yes, we should all have friends that don't look like us, right? We should all have professional connections that don't look like us, mm-hmm. because that is where you start to model some of the things we want to teach the younger generations.
The word courage, right, comes in. I mean, courage is so incredibly important in this work. And so often I find that our white peers want to have the courage, but there's fear somewhere. There's fear that holds them back. right? But if in fact they were courageous, they'd overcome that fear and actually move to a space in which they can actually begin to have the conversations. I love the idea of, affinity groups, right? And so the idea that people who have similar identities come together. And so, We Stories, it's a great program here in St. Louis in which it calls white families together to talk about race and being able to have conversations through literature for their young children. The YWCA has a wonderful program called Witnessing Whiteness. We actually have it on our campus at the university for our faculty and staff. Last year was the first year, and this year is our second. And this year, I announced it in 90 minutes. It filled to capacity within 90 minutes. And I think a big piece of that is because white folks get to come and have those conversations with each other and not have to have the fear about the missteps that I think so often they believe that they will make. And as we know, some of those missteps can really be loaded and backfire in those moments. And so having that space where they can have those conversations, I think is critically important.
And it has to be a step. It has to be one of the steps. So after they get to where they're comfortable enough to then do that, then that would be the next step. And then I would hope that even after they finish the affinity groups or the Witnessing Whiteness, that they would have the courage to then seek out ways to be around people that don't look like them, because it really does all boil down to courage. And what I always teach my white students is that, white people get to live in this country where they're never uncomfortable. Whereas African Americans, I've grown up being uncomfortable my whole life. So I can live in it, I can thrive in it, I can be productive in that environment. But They have to get to the point where they are okay being uncomfortable.
So how do they do that? I mean,
courage. That's the courage. That's the courage that we need to see. You have to step outside of everything you've done and everything you've been taught and everything you've known to want to do something different. Like, just think about what you said about yourself with the therapy. Most times when I see people for the first time, they're apprehensive and they're kind of looking like this, like, I'm here, but I don't really know why I'm here. And I don't know what's going to happen. I'm afraid because it's the unknown. But the only thing you can do is you don't get to go around that. There's no way around it. You have to walk through it to get to the other side.
I find it interesting, we think about our places of worship, right? And I think so often our spaces of worship are some of the most segregated spaces. Obviously, like-minded individuals coming together around that, faith-based piece there. But I was a member of St. John's United Church of Christ up in North St. Louis. Starsky Wilson was our pastor. And I found it so fascinating. I mean, literally, we were at North St. Louis, Grand and Lee, right at, Fairgrounds Park, Natural Bridge, and Grand. And, there were a number of white parishioners who came to the church regularly, right? Like they and held leadership roles and intentionally made that choice to bypass several other UCC churches along their way with people who looked more like them, but they intentionally chose to make it up to North St. Louis so that they could be and experience and fellowship and real meaningful relationship with people who were different than them. And I think that
takes courage. It takes courage. It takes a special kind of person who's willing to put themselves in a situation where they're going to be surrounded by difference, and they're going to deal with it and they're going to work through it, because that's essentially what it takes for everyone in this whole country. We have to all get comfortable with difference. The demographics of this country are rapidly changing. So not only do we have to be comfortable with white people need to be comfortable with Black people, we have to be comfortable with everyone that's different. This country looks totally different than it did when we were all growing up, and it's going to continue to change.
I'm going to take a couple more questions from our audience, Earl.
All right, we just got a new one here. And the question reads, what about mental exhaustion of areas with higher rate of crime, or root causes of young men joining gangs, young women getting pregnant? I understand recurrent effects of racism has pushed youth into these choices, but wanted to get your own personal and professional opinion on it.
Okay, so the first part again was,
What about the mental exhaustion of areas with higher rate of crime? And then that stems to the root causes of young men joining gangs and young women getting pregnant. And then they said they want to understand the recurrent effects of racism that has pushed youth into making these choices.
so the first part, the mental exhaustion of crime, it really takes a significant toll on the psychological and emotional um, being of a person. To live in an area where you know at any point you can be a victim of crime is exhausting. So when we have individuals that live in these environments every day, we have to know that there are going to be real life consequences of that. So those consequences could be mental health, depression, trauma, anxiety, could be sleep issues. It could be medical issues. That could be high blood pressure. It could be diabetes. It could be lots of other things. So they're going to be, those are the real life consequences of the exhaustion of living in crime. And again, it culminates into certain other things. The other part of the question was root causes of crime, such as pregnancy. So the root causes of things like I'm guessing they mean like teenage pregnancy. What are the root causes of that? Again, that's one of the things we talked about earlier, Vincent, with the breakdown of the Black family. So lots of times I've seen this in patients and young African-American girls when they don't have a father around or they don't have other members of their immediate or extended family around. Maybe their parent is working a lot. They're lonely. And many times they will say they decide to have a baby just to have someone to love or someone that loves them or someone that they can depend on. So the root cause of that can be really a lack of family structure. It could be a lack of hope. It could be lots of things. And then the third part was the effects of racism. I think we're just starting to look enough into the consequences of structural and institutional racism. What we've done so far is really blame the victim in this country. Like if you're out here and you're robbing people, what's wrong with you? Who are your parents? What are you doing? As opposed to looking at the structure that has caused that person to feel like the only way they can get anything in life, maybe it's food for that day, is to take it from someone else. They don't feel like they have any other means to get it. I think we're far away from looking at what the causes are, because that would force us to look at some of the institutional foundations that have been racist for generations. We would have to do that, and then we would be forced to change them if we were to do that.
Thank you. You have another one, Earl?
Yes. How can the educational system help shape mindsets of young white people to be anti-racist? And also, if you can you talk about the broken window syndrome?
Educational system help young white people to be anti-racist?
Yes.
How can that be done? Oh, it can be done, but I think we're far from that. It can be done if we were to have teachers and districts that really engage in the type of work that we want allies to do. But in order for that to happen, it would take such a high level of understanding of institutional racism that we're far off from that. I think what we can expect and what we can hope for are individual teachers at this point to take it upon themselves and to learn and do trainings and to try to be better. And then maybe those individual teachers can then talk to their coworkers and peers, and maybe that's where it can start.
It's interesting. Several local districts, Clayton, Webster Groves, I know for sure, have recently posted positions, district-wide level administrative roles of similar to my role at the University of, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the district. And I've read through many of those descriptions, and much of it is looking at trying to systemically, institutionally throughout the district, begin to raise these questions and programming and trainings and workshops, right? And so in a way in which it really becomes district-wide versus classroom, right? And the individual classroom, and we know many teachers who are doing some great work within their classroom, but they're just one classroom in a building of many rooms, right? And so they're touching, but they're not being able to have that real deep impact. And so the districts, are needing to actually at this point really take a stance and really commit themselves to doing this work as a district.
But then I feel like the other piece that's been missing in many of the districts locally is that this has always been the case for teachers. The professional development that deals with diversity is optional.
Yeah.
It's always optional. Yeah, or it's very easy. It's not uncomfortable. It's nothing that would make them really challenge their thinking. So what has to happen, and I talked to the superintendent of my children's district and let them know, it has to be mandatory and it has to be something that's experiential. You have to put them in an environment where they can test these skills, not just listen and be lectured to. They have to be able to think through it, discuss it, test these skills, and then be at a different level with the concept of what that means. But just the whole, like, especially now with, you're going to sit them in front of a computer and they're going to watch someone else talk about it. That's no way for anyone to learn about institutional racism.
Right. And I also think if we're going to mandate it, it also should be something that we evaluate, right? And so that you also are held accountable throughout your time, right? And so it's provide us evidence that shows that you actually were working towards creating a more diverse curriculum, you were delivering a more equitable, and so I think that's another piece of it that I think should be looked at as well.
That's the performance-based.
Yeah.
And we're far away from that, but I do hope, at least in my lifetime, that that's something that we get to.
Yeah. And was there a second part of that question?
About broken windows? I got a piece of it.
The broken window syndrome. I wasn't familiar with that.
So the broken window syndrome is the exhaustion of being surrounded by crime, which you have talked about already, stemming from the white community being in these separate areas. And I think the question I wanted to lead into is how can that educational system with that broken glass syndrome stem into something better for the future, if that made sense?
How can it stem into something for the future? Well, I think we've all seen cases where it can be the individual is resilient and resourceful and can come out of that situation where they're surrounded by crime because they want something better for themselves, or because they have a mentor or a model who helps them to show them that there's something they can achieve better. Maybe they go off to college and they're influenced by good people and they excel from there. So there are many ways that it can happen, but I think a lot of researchers over the years have looked at why does it happen for some people and why does it not happen for other people? And there are many, many different answers as to why. Some of it is rooted in our DNA. Some of it is rooted in our personality. Some of it is just rooted in our temperament. Like there are some personality types that are more likely to go against the grain and to keep trying, whereas others are going to sit back and take more of a helpless approach. So I guess it's a question it's probably too complex to answer at one time.
And I would also just add to that, as a Black man, I've been fortunate and blessed to not grow up in that environment. But yet I still experience stress. I still experience racism. And so I don't want us to really think of in terms of Black folks have to, first of all, that we all grow up in an environment like that, for one. I want us to really be clear about that. And two, that those of us who still don't grow up in those environments still experience, of course, racism and the stressors of that and the impact that it has on us. And so I guess I just wanted to kind of be clear in terms of.
That's a good point. Because that sometimes, I don't know if you've been asked this question before, Vincent, that they see you in a professional setting and I said, I got this when I was finishing up my Ph.D. Well, I bet your parents are really proud of you.
Yeah.
I would be like, well, aren't all parents proud of their children? Like, why are my parents, because they're Black, more proud of me? They expected me to excel and I did. So I'm not sure that they're shocked by anything that I've done.
or the other one of, you're not like.
You don't sound like the rest of them.
Yeah, right. And, those are definitely the microaggressions, and those are definitely racist, comments.
Yes.
Because what you're saying is that I'm challenging your racist thought about what Black folks are supposed to look like, act like, have achieved, and there's I'm a challenge to you, and so that's how that comes out. Really interesting, really interesting. Dr. Woody Cooper, I've really enjoyed our time here together, and I'm wondering if you could maybe highlight some of your resources that you are aware of, your Facebook page that folks can be in touch and walk away from this experience. We will post some of this on our landing page at webster.edu /Webster Speaks tomorrow. So share with us and we'll get that posted.
If you're looking for, my website is www.drjameca.com, and my office number is 1-8338 call doctor. So if you're looking for services, I will say I have a bit of a wait list now, as do all Black psychologists in the St. Louis area have waiting lists for months just because of the increase in numbers. But I would definitely say Psychology Today is a resource. So even if I'm booked or I have a wait list, there are other African-American therapists in St. Louis who would be more than happy to be able to assist you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I also want to take the time to encourage you all to join us next week. Our guest will be, our topic next week will be how the media covers race. And we will have special guest Carol Daniel. Those of you in St. Louis, we will recognize her as the voice of St. Louis at KMOX, as a news anchor and president of the Greater St. Louis Association of Black Journalists. Joining us will be Eric Deggans, who is an NPR TV critic and author of a book, Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation. That'll be on Wednesday, August 19th. So I invite you to join us. At this time, I'd also like to invite our chancellor, Dr. Beth Strobel, to join us and share some parting words with us.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both. We are so fortunate, I think, all three of us, as people associated with a university and university life, to be in a community that at least says it's about learning. And as you've said so well tonight, the depth and the willingness of each of us to embark on new learning on a variety of topics, how to be a better person, how to be a better member of our community, how to make a better world, is a lifelong journey. And I want to thank you tonight for helping expand my learning, and certainly I'm sure that of people that have tuned in. Every week that we do this, my learning gets deeper and broader, and it just fuels my interest to do more. So thank you, thank you. And I want to thank both of you for the focus you have chosen in your careers. It's wonderful to have you as Webster colleagues, and thank you for the generosity of how willing you are to share your knowledge and your experience on topics that absolutely should make people uncomfortable. Because as an educator myself, I will say that the deepest learning comes from a place of discomfort.
Yes.
And that the deepest learning comes from a place where we assent to learn, that we are eager, we're hungry for the learning. And deep learning is not a casual enterprise. And it's best done in community. You've highlighted that tonight, that testing the ideas and experiences and being able to challenge those in a place that causes more learning to happen is part of what we all need to be about as educators and as lifelong learners ourselves. And I think about how often education, whether we're talking about book knowledge or we're talking about helping people be healthier individuals mentally, psychologically, socially, in all those ways, that we've kind of dealt with superficial and symptoms and not root causes in so many ways. And mental health is part of that. And when we think about the barriers to us actually together, creating communities and environments where everyone's health is prized and supported and encouraged, we know, as you've said, we're far off from that. And so each of us is challenged as an individual to join together with others to try to advance that as individuals and join hand in hand to make that effort collectively add up to more. So I just really want to applaud the kinds of good ideas you've suggested to us tonight. And I do hope that everyone who's tuned in will follow up with your resources. And we'll tune in for the next session because we're just going to keep going. And we're eager to connect with each of you through Twitter, Facebook, email, all the ways you want to be part of this great learning community. There's a lot to learn, and you've helped us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Strobel. And again, thank you, Dr. Woody Cooper. We really appreciate your insight and your time and your conversation with me tonight. And again, I'd like to once again invite you all to join me on Wednesday, August 19th. And again, when we will discuss how the media covers race, special guests, Carol Daniel and Eric Deggans. Thank you all very much. Have a good evening. And I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.